Regardless of whether you are a first-time landlord or a professional with years of property management experience, some tenants' complaints can make you pretty confused. In this podcast, we cover the top 5 tenant complaints from 2019, as well as what you may be able to expect going into 2020 and what you can do to address those complaints and maybe even get ahead of them. Hi everybody, my name is Chris, and I want to thank you for joining us for another value-packed TenantCloud podcast. If you want to be a more informed, better educated, and successful landlord, then stay tuned. With over a decade of property management experience, we bring you short and sweet, bite-sized pieces of incredibly valuable property management tidbits in 15 minutes or less. So it's no secret that complaints are pretty common in property management, and anybody who's been a landlord or property manager for any extent of time at all definitely has a very keen understanding of that. And so it's no surprise that in property management you're going to hear a lot of different types of complaints, but it really does boil down to these core 5 things that tenants complain the most about. Everything else is just kind of little nitpicking things, but there are really core things that tenants really just aren't happy about. And these are the 5 things that we're going to cover in this podcast. And a lot of these I've had personal experience with. Some of these things you probably have read about them online here and there, but we wanted to kind of condense them all into this short list so that you could really hear them all in one place and kind of formulate your own opinion on it, and maybe even plan ahead. And because these are consistent, these aren't just it's not, we say it's 2019, but really these are complaints that are generally pretty consistent, especially at least for the past decade or so, because of certain circumstances in the real estate market. But there are ways that you can kind of help mitigate some of these issues that come up with tenants. And so without further ado, we'll jump in. The number one issue that tenants complain about is high security deposits. And if you have ever been a renter, then you know that this one is definitely, or can definitely be, a pain point. If you're looking to rent a $2,000 house, for instance, a lot of times rentals are like a house are going to ask for first and last month's rent up front. So you're talking about at least a minimum of $4,000 up front for a deposit for a house. And so that can get really steep, and it can be very much a barrier to entry into a rental. And for that reason, a lot of tenants sometimes just decide to stay put. So you actually could have somebody who tours your rental, but then your high security deposits kind of prevent them from actually wanting to apply for your rental. They might love it. You might have done a killer sales job on it. The house might have sold itself. They love the location. They love the amenities, but man, that deposit to get into that rental is ridiculous. And so it's just something to keep in mind. It's one of the reasons that tenants find that this is a pain point for them is not just the fact that it's a lot of money, but because there's just a common distrust in and a lack of understanding of what a normal wear and tear is versus, like, for instance, damages. So when they move out of a rental and you take their security deposit and you start applying it to all these various charges for move out charges, and then you take $4,000 and they only get $1,500 back. Well, that's a concern for tenants because that is a lot of money to just give somebody and then not really have a clear understanding of where it went or why it wasn't returned to them. And so part of that is literally just the fact that there are a lot of gray areas when it comes to what is wear and tear versus what is actual damages in a rental. And it can change based on the amount of time that a person spends in a rental. So if somebody lives at a rental for 5 years and they move out and you apply all their deposit to all these damages, a lot of tenants are going to have a hard time with that because they lived there for 5 years. And so it really just it depends on the rental, the lease term, how long the tenant stays there, the amount of the deposit, and so on and so forth. But in general, tenants have a general distrust in the whole, I will get my deposit back at the end of the lease, even if I take care of this place to the best of my abilities. And so one of the possible solutions for this, and that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we did in this podcast, is that not just talk about the complaints that the tenants have, but also possible solutions and how you can get ahead of it. So one of the things that you can do, and many landlords have started doing this, is little simple things. Like, for instance, I used to provide a pricing sheet that literally had the cost on each line item for everything from fist-size holes in the wall to light bulb and battery replacements and installation costs, to if I had to paint the entire rental from top to bottom. And so the more transparent you are in that process with the security deposit and with your move-out process, and when you would keep a deposit and how much of it you would keep based on the circumstances or the condition that the rental was left in, it's a lot easier to gain trust and to resolve disputes when they do arise, because tenants do dispute security deposit charges. Happens a lot. In fact, it ends up in court quite a bit too. So it's not something you want to mess around with. It is something that tenants take very seriously. And so you should also take it very seriously, not just because tenants take it seriously, but because it is governed by existing law in, I believe, every state and every county and every jurisdiction. So it's something that you have to be careful with, something you want to be transparent with, and something you absolutely need to have integrity with as well, and have a very clear, formulated process for how you deal with move-out damages. So that is the number one complaint, is high security deposits, and am I going to get my money back at the end of my lease term? The second one is rental increases, or just the cost of living in general. I discussed this in a previous podcast that we did, I believe, a couple weeks back. And we had sent out a survey to TenantCloud tenants, people who have an account on TenantCloud as a tenant. And one of the questions was about livability and the cost of living and stuff like that. And what are your general complaints about the rental industry, and so on and so forth. And the number one thing that came back to us was rental increases, or the cost of living is too high. It's hard to find an affordable rental. And so we all know that in the past decade, especially, rental increases are not uncommon. I think everybody knows there's pretty much been a shortage of rentals across the country. So definitely landlords and property management companies have been able to take advantage of that and increase the rates at rates that are typically higher than what you would normally see on average. For instance, there's been plenty of studies, and you can find these cited in some of our blog posts about this topic, but the average rental increase is generally considered to be around 3% nationally. But a lot of areas in the country over the past decade have seen as high as 5, 10, and even 15% year over year annual increases. Not every year for the past decade, but they have seen those increases in different areas of the country. It's not abnormal to see crazy rental increases in areas of the country that are in high demand, such as Austin, Texas, for instance. And so you have to keep that in mind, is that rental increase can push your tenants away, and it can increase your vacancy rates and how long your rental sits on the market. And so, yeah, you want to take into consideration things like your cost for turning the rental, for marketing it when it is vacant or leading up to the vacancy, the screening and acquiring that new tenant and getting them in the door, and the unknown of whether that tenant is actually going to be a good fit despite your best screening efforts. And so there's a lot of cost that comes into that. So you really have to decide, is it worth it to increase my rent on this property by X amount, or should I even increase it at all? Will I make more money, and will my profit margins increase the longer I keep this existing tenant here? And so you've got to ask yourself that question. And so that's a recommended solution to consider is, and keep in mind, some landlords have actually started doing this. It's becoming more common. I've started hearing it a lot more, in that a lot of landlords are not increasing rent at all in their markets. They get a good tenant in. The tenant is paying rent on time. They're not a hassle. They're not putting in a ton of stupid maintenance requests. and they'll just let the lease go month to month, and they will not send a renewal, and they don't reach out to the tenant, and the tenant keeps paying rent. And eventually it's like this thing where like the tenant just doesn't even want to reach out to the landlord because they think, well, maybe the landlord forgot about me, and that's why they haven't increased my rent, and I don't want my rent to increase, so I'm gonna continue to be as good of a tenant as possible. And so a lot of landlords have really found that theory is good. It works good for them. And so I'm not sure if it works in every market or if it even works for you. Obviously, it comes down to your business plan and your growth plan and all that good stuff. But if you're just managing a couple houses and you're happy with that rent that's coming in and you don't want to risk losing that tenant, well, then maybe you should consider not doing a rental increase, because that is the number 2 top complaint from tenants in 2019 and has been that way for a little while now. And based on our survey, it sounds like it's going to continue for a while, especially if you look at all the articles being printed about a continued shortage of rental properties across the nation. Number 3 is unresolved maintenance issues. So in property management, one of the primary reasons that tenants end up not renewing their lease, aside from price, is because they're just unhappy with how maintenance issues were resolved, or if they were even resolved at all. And it could be a matter of how long it takes to resolve maintenance issues. It could be how it was resolved. It could be how often the same issue is reoccurring, such as like if an AC system keeps going out in the middle of the summer and they have kids or dogs, or they just don't want to deal with it. Tenants in general don't want to deal with maintenance problems. That's usually the number one reason that somebody who can afford to buy on their own or has alternative options, the number one reason they rent is because usually they don't want to deal with being a homeowner. And being a homeowner, a big part of that is dealing with maintenance issues and maintenance upkeep. And so something as simple as having to change the AC filter, tenants are paying you to take care of your rental property. They're paying you for that convenience. They don't want to have to do this stuff, changing the batteries on the smoke detectors, doing fire alarm tests, that type of thing throughout every year. Like, tenants in general don't want to deal with that stuff. And it's always kind of amazed me in my experience in property management and seeing all of the landlords and property managers that want to put all of these responsibilities back on the tenant for their property that the tenant is paying to rent temporarily. And so, and without keeping in mind that, well, the reason this tenant is renting is because they don't want to have to deal with all this stuff. And second of all, it's not their house, and so they're not going to take care of it like you would to begin with. And the number one breakdown reason, for instance, for ACs is not changing the AC filter, because a lot of people don't know that you need to change your AC filter every 30, 60, 90 days max. And if you have a pet, for instance, that sheds, it definitely has to be every 30 days. And so things like that, a lot of people just don't think about because they don't want to think about it. They're paying somebody else to think about that. And so one of the possible solutions for this complaint is be proactive about your maintenance schedule for your rentals. If you can get ahead of these things before they become issues, and you stop putting the responsibility on the tenant and instead just retain that responsibility and put it on a schedule, I think that you'll see that you'll solve a lot of problems before they become a problem. So for instance, putting your AC system on a regularly scheduled service schedule, whether it's you or somebody on your team or a third-party contractor, whatever it is, I would recommend just putting on a schedule, whether that's a 30, 60, 90 day, whatever it is, and take care of those things like swapping out the AC filter every 30 or 60 days and check the batteries and the smoke detectors and do the smoke alarm test every quarter, every 6 months, or every year, whatever your area requires, and that type of thing. And stop putting the responsibility back on the tenant to do those things and do it yourself, because again, can't harp on this enough. A lot of tenants, myself included, when I was renting, if I was renting a rental property, I did not want to be responsible for doing things like that. I didn't even want to change light bulbs or have to go shopping for light bulbs out of my busy schedule in an apartment. And so one of my questions when I toured rentals would always be, What am I responsible for in terms of maintenance? Do I have to replace light bulbs? Do I have to replace smoke detector batteries? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? Because if I do, then I'm not interested in paying you $1,500 a month, and I will go somewhere else. And so that's just something to keep in mind, and just make life easier for your tenants, make life more convenient, and also get ahead of anything that might become an issue and maybe make it a non-issue. Make life easier for everybody. The next point is number 3, lack of communication. Let's imagine that you took off, let's say a Friday off of work, and you're not trying to do a whole lot, right? It's your 3-day weekend, you're trying to relax, stay in bed a little later than normal, move at a slower pace than what you would normally be moving at on a Friday morning, right? And at 8 a.m. on the dot, a heavy construction truck rumbles right up in front of your house. Next, crew hops out, they pull out a jackhammer and start jacking the street and the sidewalk up. Apparently, they're trying to do some repairs on some pipe buried underneath the road or the sidewalk, something like that, right? Would have been great to know that. Maybe you would have taken a different Friday off. Maybe, if you had known that. But unlike in property management or in landlording, it's not common for the city to notify you about stuff like that. However, it is normal practice for a landlord to notify their tenants of any known planned work at a rental property, especially if it sits on private property and the work is being done on said private property. And that is one of the biggest frustrations for tenants, is when things like that and other things are not properly communicated. It does not take much effort to look up reviews online for the various property management companies and rental properties and see that communication is not necessarily the thing that landlords excel at. And so if you want to be a top-notch landlord and get ahead of your tenants' complaints about your property and improve your reviews online and just improve your communication with your tenants, you need to focus on this part. You need to be proactive in your communication efforts, and that is our possible solution here is email, text, Facebook groups, property message boards, whatever it is, wherever you have contact with your tenants, post it far and wide. Over communicate. At least if you over communicate, you can always point to the various platforms that you sent the message out on and be like, look, I tried every way possible to let you know. And I mean, if you didn't see it, there's not much else I could do to help you out here. Like, I literally put this everywhere I could. And so being proactive, and just keep in mind that your tenants have a life as well. If you need them and their pets out of the apartment for a pest control treatment or for a property inspection or whatever it is, make sure that you give them as many days notice in advance as possible, because people have to take time off for work. They have to make arrangements to have their pet dropped off somewhere or watched by somebody or in a house and board type place for pets. Just be considerate and remember that your tenants do have lives and they have families and responsibilities just like you, and they need to be able to plan ahead of time for stuff. Even though it's your property and they're just renting it from you, you need to make sure that you are communicating and over communicating with your tenants and just make life easier for them. And that will help you get ahead of the complaint that a lot of tenants feel like there is a lack of communication. The next one is no pets policy or restricted breed policies. And so this one is a big one. And we've had a few podcasts on this. We've had quite a few blog posts on this. And in general, it's a hotly debated topic if you look at any type of property management forum online about should I allow pets, and if so, should I have restricted breed policies? And there have been a lot of studies and research done on this topic, and we've cited a lot of them in a lot of our blogs. So if you want to look that up, definitely encourage you to do that. But the bottom line is landlords almost always come out on top financially, even after pet damages. In fact, pet damages are a lot less across the board than what most people guess. In fact, you've probably heard all the horror stories that make the news and get talked about because bad news and sad news and all that stuff always sells better, and people tend to talk about that stuff more. But despite all of the horrific things you've heard about pets in the rental, the reality is very, very different based on some pretty established research on this subject. And for many landlords, it's really just a matter of, for instance, one of the most common ones is broken or chewed up blinds because a dog likes to look out the window all the time. And that's what, $50, $75, $100, depending on the window. Maybe if you have high end, you're talking $200. But if you charged a pet security deposit, you've already covered that cost when that tenant actually ends up moving out. For others, it might be replacing, $400 worth of carpet in a rental because you can't get the pet odors out, depending on how long the pet was there and whether they were potty trained to go outside, that type of thing. Great. Take the funds out of the pet security deposit. On top of that, most landlords who allow pets in rentals often charge a pet fee, a monthly pet rental. And that is usually above and beyond whatever the market rate is for that rental anyway. And so you're already making that additional money. So for instance, if you charge, and this is part of our recommended or possible solution, is if you're charging an extra $20 per month per pet and someone has 2 pets, that's an extra $40 a month on top of the pet deposit that you've charged to cover any potential damages. So at the end of a 24-month rental, you've earned $960 more than what the average market rent is. And the chances are that, again, based on research, shows that pet owners tend to stay at a rental longer. Why? Well, because it's more difficult to relocate when you own a pet. It really comes down to convenience and logistics. And a lot of barriers to entry as well, because a lot of places have really high pet deposits or really high pet fees, or they just don't allow pets at all. And so pet owners have to take those things into consideration. And not just that, it doesn't just come down to the rental things. It also comes down to where it's located at. Do they have access to parks? Do they have a patio? Do they have a yard? Do they have a fenced in area? Do they have access to city parks? Things like that. And so there's this whole thing when a pet owner finds a great rental that accommodates both them and their pet, they just tend to stay longer. And I don't remember the exact percentage based on the research. Again, it's in a few of our different blog articles at tenantcloud.com/blog, but the numbers are big. It's a big difference. It translates into a lot of extra revenue from your rental just by renting out to pet owners. And so this is the number 5 complaint about no pets policy or restricted breed policies. It's hard for me as a tenant to find a place to rent that A, allows me and a pet, and B, allows restricted breeds. And so keep that in mind with your tenants and with your policies for your rental, and you might see a big change if you make changes. And definitely something to consider, especially if you're experiencing higher vacancy rates or longer vacancy rates for your rental properties. And that pretty much wraps up this podcast episode. I know this one went a little bit longer than what we normally try to shoot for at 15 minutes, and I apologize for that, but I hope that this information provided you with some significant value and some insight into how to prepare for 2020 and to kind of get ahead of the tenant complaints that we've been seeing for 2019 based on our research and third-party research. And just in general, over the past decade, some of these things have just kind of been a pretty consistent thing over the years. Nothing's really changed too much. So to help yourself, set yourself a head and shoulder above other landlords and other property management companies and other rental properties, I'd highly recommend that you take a look at these 5 things and really see how you can implement some changes at your own rental property or in your own management policies. And we wish you luck going into 2020. As always, if you have appreciated any of the content that you hear in this podcast, please feel free to rate us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere that you are listening to this. Feel free to chime in. And also you can find our blogs that a lot of these podcasts are based off of at tenantcloud.com/blog. You can also find us on YouTube, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere that media content is created. Tenant Cloud is there. Just type in Tenant Cloud in Google and then whatever you're looking for. Tenant Cloud blog, Tenant Cloud podcast, Tenant Cloud FAQ videos, all that good stuff. And we'll look forward to talking with you next time.